What's up guys, it's Aaronitmar. What if I told you that there was a third Banjo-Kazooie game and you probably just forgot about it? No, I'm not talking about that game. That's the game we all wish we could forget. I'm talking about a different game which began development at the same time as Banjo-Tooie and actually maintains the roots of the Banjo series. The game I'm talking about is Banjo-Kazooie Grunty's Revenge for the Game Boy Advance. But wait, what was that Grunty just pulled out of her cauldron? Is that a sponsorship? Today's video is sponsored by Amino. Amino is the social media app that has topics and communities for anything and everything, and now it's getting even better with the launch of their brand new Stories feature. Think of Amino Stories like other social apps have, but they don't disappear after 24 hours. Amino reached out to me and I've decided to join the fun by making some fun condensed content for my stories. So check out the link down below to download Amino, search for my username, and follow me to know when I post a new story. Hot off the success of Banjo-Kazooie, Rare began the development phase on several Banjo follow-up games. One of course became Banjo-Tooie, the direct sequel for the N64, and another was entitled Banjo-Kazooie Grunty's Curse, a 2D Banjo-Kazooie game for release on the Game Boy Color. Development on Grunty's Curse began in August 1999, and it made it into the early art phases with designers working on sprites before Rare halted production later that same year. Meanwhile, a much bigger team completed Banjo-Tooie, and that game was released with huge success. Around this time, Nintendo released the Game Boy Advance in 2001, which piqued Rare's interest to revive that previously cancelled Banjo game. Grunty's Curse was retitled to Grunty's Revenge, and with a full second game completed, the team had far more to go off of in terms of characters, mechanics, and world building, which influenced the game's development and changed the story from the initial Grunty's Curse draft. While the game was announced at E3 2001, Rare was having financial issues as they were only a second-party developer, and they were hoping to be purchased by a major company to have far more funding for their games. Of course, Nintendo was in the discussion for this, being a very close partner with Rare, but Microsoft ended up purchasing the company in 2002. However, this purchase of a competing company didn't deter the development of the game, as Microsoft didn't have a stake in the handheld market, so they were totally on board with it coming out for the Game Boy Advance. All of the mobile games that they had planned kept up a steady workflow, and THQ came on board to publish them. Grunty's Revenge finally released in 2003, and was the first Rare game to release after Microsoft's 2002 buyout. It's pretty funny because Grunty's Revenge is actually my first experience with Banjo-Kazooie at all. I found the game at a yard sale for like $2, and I immensely enjoyed it. But since I never had a Nintendo 64 growing up, I never knew that it was the third game in a series. It wouldn't be until a few years later that I would finally be able to play Banjo-Kazooie and Tooie. Grunty's Revenge takes place 2 months after the events of Banjo-Kazooie, with Klungo trying to move the rock that Grunty is crushed under during the first game's boss battle. Eventually realizing that he can't move the rock, he creates a robot for Grunty to project her soul into, which she then uses to kidnap Kazooie and inexplicably travel back in time. Her grand plan is to prevent Banjo from meeting Kazooie so that the two could not stop her in the first game. Mumbo sends Banjo back to the same time using a very strong magic spell, and Banjo meets Bottle's ancestor, Bozai. And then time travel is never really mentioned again. Eventually, you save Kazooie in the second world, and your movement, combat, and exploration abilities are all greatly enhanced. Spiral Mountain exists as a main hub for the player, connecting to each of the 5 worlds found in the game. Just like in Banjo-Tooie, the player needs to collect Jiggies and return them to Jiggy Wiggy's temple in order to gain access to further worlds. Despite the small number, the game's 5 worlds hit most of the themes found in a Banjo-Kazooie game. You have your grassland, a beach area, a harbor, a swamp, and an ice world. And while there isn't a fire world, the ice world Freezing Furnace takes a page from Hailfire Peak's book and has a subworld, Grunty Industries, which covers both the fire and factory themes as well. And if you're looking for a collectathon, Grunty's Revenge does not disappoint. You'll find music notes to pay for new moves, Jiggies to unlock further worlds, empty honeycomb pieces to expand your health, and Jinjos, eggs, and feathers. Alongside that are world-specific collectibles like coins, ice cream, and live baby chicks. But Grunty's Revenge isn't just a copy and paste. The development team thought up some new mechanics as well, both out of necessity because of the hardware and just out of pure creativity. Minigames are one such case. Banjo-Kazooie and Tooie's jiggy-earning minigames wouldn't really translate well to the Game Boy Advance, so all new minigames needed to be developed. One is a slide minigame, which has Banjo sliding down collecting items while avoiding obstacles. Another is a fishing minigame, with the player controlling the power that Banjo uses to throw the line, and collecting anything that comes back. The final new minigame is a top-down vehicle-based minigame where Banjo must either hold on to a treasure chest longer than his opponents, or collect more items than the rest of his opponents. Because of the limited hardware and minimal buttons, these minigames are pretty basic, but they get the job done. The only downside is that you have to do each one effectively twice, because there are 2 versions of each minigame throughout the game, and they're just kinda tweaked a little bit each time. A big part of the world of Banjo-Kazooie is magic, and Mumbo Jumbo returns as a much younger, cooler dude with his 80s style bachelor pad, complete with disco balls and lava lamps. At this point in time, Mumbo is only an apprentice shaman, but he still successfully transforms Banjo at the cost of 1 Mumbo token. And rather than finding these Mumbo tokens throughout the worlds, each level features a mini-boss fight which rewards you with a Jiggy and a Mumbo token. Grunty's Revenge has brand new transformations made just for this game. Banjo can turn into a rat, an octopus, a tank, and a candle. That's right, a giant moving monster candle. Something neat about Mumbo's pad in this game is that you can turn into any transformation in any world simply by selecting it through the scrolling menu. You aren't limited to 1 transformation per world. And this is a really neat feature, though it's not one that's super useful outside of a couple of instances. The game really tries to cut down on backtracking, and I can only think of maybe 2 or 3 instances where you'll be returning to a past world to use an ability that you got in a later world. Any console Banjo player who's new to this game is going to find themselves readjusting to the controls and mechanics of this game. The translation into a top-down 2D-ish environment works fairly well, but you'll find yourself also having panic moments where you aren't really sure where you are in the air. The game relies on Banjo's shadow to help with jumps, but either because of the busyness of the world, the poor quality of the screen, or simply because the shadow simply doesn't stick out, missing jumps can be very common early on. You also won't find yourself flying at all. It was planned for the game but ended up being scrapped, so the most you're going to be able to do is do Kazooie's little hover flap thing. Golden feathers are also activated differently using a special pad now rather than a button combination, and while eggs are available, they're mostly used for puzzle solving and they're way too slow to use for combat. The exception is when you encounter egg shooting mini-bosses, which are very arcade style and they limit Banjo's movement to left and right while aiming a cursor at the enemies, so again you're not even using these eggs in the overworld. The Banjo series charm often comes from the interaction between characters, but unfortunately this is something that's kind of lacking in Grunty's Revenge. You get the occasional banter, but overall the characters simply ask for help and Banjo and Kazooie agree. And this is kind of a shame because while game mechanics and level depth are dumbed down simply because of the console's power, writing and dialogue definitely didn't need to suffer, and they could have easily been up to par with the first 2 games. And we can't talk about a Banjo-Kazooie game without talking about the music. Heck, even Nuts and Bolts, which is loathed for pretty much everything, has very pleasant music. Unlike its predecessors, the music for Grunty's Revenge was not composed by Grant Kirkhope, but by Jamie Hughes, a new hire for Rare at the time. This was Hughes' first project with Rare, and those are some mighty big shoes to fill. But I think Hughes did a fine job. The music encapsulates everything that is Banjo-Kazooie music, and the tunes themselves are very catchy. I think where the soundtrack falls flat is simply the hardware it was on. The Game Boy Advance was simply a product of its time, and it just couldn't produce the greatest sounds. It didn't have the greatest sound chip, so the music for any Game Boy Advance game can really feel limited. To further my point, an online user named BanjoFella converted all of the songs into a MIDI file, which he then translated into the sound font from the original N64 games. It sounds a lot more complicated than it is. Basically, he just played the songs with the sounds from Banjo-Kazooie. And they just sound great. In fact, that's mostly what you've been listening to for pretty much this whole video. There's a link down in the description to the SoundCloud playlist where he has them all done. He did some awesome work, so I highly recommend going and checking that out. So any criticism of the music, in my opinion, can definitely be blamed on the limited hardware. Now, I would hate myself if I didn't make fun of something about this game really quickly, and it's not specifically the Game Boy Advance game. Back in the early 2000s, cell phones were getting just good enough to run games. Now, they weren't good games, mind you. The technology was basically one step up from Monochrome Snake, but they just weren't great games. So for many game developers, this was their very first attempt at any kind of a mobile game. They obviously weren't good though. I mean, even the very first iPhone games were much better than whatever we had to play on our flip phones. They were pretty much all terrible, but it was a try. And somehow, someway, Grunty's Revenge was one of those games that they tried with. The game was ported for mobile phones in 2005. It basically just took the assets from the Game Boy Advance version and used them in the phone game. What can I say? It was a game. It functioned. It worked. Surprisingly, it plays similarly to Grunty's Revenge, just in a more limited form. And when you consider that Grunty's Revenge is already a limited form of Banjo-Kazooie, it just feels weird. But they really couldn't do much more. I mean, consider the kind of keypad that you had to play on. You were basically limited to the 4 directions. You couldn't even go diagonally. The worlds in this game were tiny, the combat and movement are just so basic, and there are 0 transformations. But I'll also say that it doesn't really feel like it was thrown together. Each time you enter a world, it plays a short MIDI version of the level song using whatever the phone was capable of, which is honestly far more than I would have expected from this time in mobile game development. But then the song stops and you're kind of just stuck in this very silent, empty, boring world. The different boss fights and the actual moves you can use are pretty one-to-one, and it follows pretty much exactly the same story. I honestly feel like if Grunty's Revenge came out just a few years later and they attempted a different mobile version with more advanced phones, it would have been at least a passable game instead of just kind of laughable. Weirdly, cell phones saw another related game released even earlier than this, which was called Banjo-Kazooie Grunty's Revenge Missions. And as the name implies, it was simply a compilation of all of the mini-games from the Game Boy Advance version packed into a single cell phone game. It was probably done to test the waters for the reception of Banjo on cell phones, and the mini-games probably translated much smoother than the full-on platforming gameplay. I can't believe that was a game that was on people's phones. It's just amazing to me. Banjo-Kazooie Grunty's Revenge does a passable job at being a banjo game. It has decent gameplay, catchy music, and when there is dialogue, it definitely hits the right tone. There's just not very much of it. I honestly just think that this game was not at all suited for the Game Boy Advance. So many of the platforming games that you'll find for Game Boy Advance are very much 2D side-scrollers, and while Banjo made an attempt at breaking the mold and having 3D movement, I just don't know that it worked as well as it could have on maybe the N64. You just aren't really left with a satisfied feeling after playing Grunty's Revenge the same way you are with Kazooie and Tooie. You kind of get to the end, you beat the boss, and then that's it. It more or less, personally, just makes me want to go and play Kazooie or Tooie again. Once the nostalgia rush from my childhood wears off, I just kind of want to play one of the originals. If you're aching for some new Banjo content though, and you've never played this version of the game, or maybe you just want something to hold you over until Banjo releases in Smash, I'd say check this game out. The worst you can do is not really care for it and then go back to Banjo-Kazooie or Tooie. You might be constantly comparing it to the N64 games, but at the end of the day, you aren't going to hate it. It might not be the Banjo 3E that we all wanted, but it's a fun few hours. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this different kind of a video. I'm very passionate about Banjo games, and this is a game that I never hear talked about, so I just wanted to make a video on it because I think it's pretty interesting. If you guys enjoyed this video, please hit the like button. If you guys are new, be sure to subscribe. I will see you guys next time. Peace out, and I hope you have a great day.